Good day, everybody, and welcome to our short course on cost cap insurance. This is actually one in a series of short courses we're going to be delivering over the coming days. These courses are meant to be highly focused and educational, very relevant to your business, and also very brief, 15 to 20 minutes, so we can get a lot of impactful information to you in a short amount of time and get you back to work to deal with your busy business day. So with that, let's go to the next slide. So here's our agenda today. We're going to talk about, yes, there actually is a cost cap market. We'll talk about what it is and go through a history of it. We'll talk about the current marketplace. We'll discuss mechanically how cost cap insurance works, the needs for underwriting it, applications, and we'll also go through a case study. So with that, next slide. I'm your presenter today, Jim Vetter. I'm a managing director with Marsh. Been with the company 19 years, and I focus on merger acquisitions and complex risks. So with that, let's start the presentation. So cost cap, this is one that, is interesting when you do talk to people. A lot of people aren't really aware of it. You may find some people to say, I remember back in the day when it used to be there, but cost cap doesn't exist anymore. The bottom line is cost cap really never went away. So it's kind of like the old movies from the 30s. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. Cost cap exists. It is here. So let's go in and talk about exactly what it is and how you can use it. So what is cost cap? Fundamentally, it's an insurance policy. It's an insurance policy that's standalone. And what it simply covers is cost overruns on environmental cleanup projects. So if we think about like what we do at home, we want to do an upgrade on a kitchen. We have a professional come in, they give us an estimate, it's going to be 15, 20 grand, which is probably low in today. But once they do the work and things play out, it ends up being more, 35, 40 grand. So even in our common lives, projects overrun. And the same thing occurs with cleanup projects. No matter how good the engineers put together estimates, those estimates are, quote, estimates. They're the best guesses. The ultimate project cost often varies and usually it overruns. So cost cap insurance has been around to deal with that since the 1990s. So it's a pretty mature product. There was a real heyday back in the early 2000s where environmental consultants were coming to companies and saying, I'll give you a guaranteed fixed price to clean up, or I'll buy out your liability. And they were using cost cap to kind of manage their risk so that they can come in and give you a really aggressive price and not have to speculate on things. The speculation was taken up and managed with cost cap. So the markets at the time were AIG, Zurich, Excel, and ACE. Those markets all burned catastrophically on this bet of, can I insure cost overruns? Bottom line is they took massive losses. In fact, none of these markets will ever come back in and do this again. The bottom line is, their buffers were too low, or where they were attaching. We'll go into the mechanics a little bit later, but what they were doing is we would come in with a number and they would either agree with the number or a little bit over. And guess what? It was just blowing through those numbers too often. And insurance isn't designed to basically provide a loss on every policy. It's designed to have a certain loss ratio, and this loss ratio is just really bad. But the good news is, if we go to the next slide, there actually is a current cost cap market. So even though AIG, ACE, Excel, and Zurich went out of business, pretty quickly others came back in. They kind of learned and saw what went wrong with the prior product, learned from it, and said, you know what? We can offer this and do it in a way that actually provides meaningful risk transfer to you and is manageable from an insurance perspective. So it's been back for over years. You hear a lot of people say, oh, geez, it doesn't exist, or it just came back. It's been back. Axis was the very first who came back into the marketplace. And then they were very shortly followed by Beasley and Ironshore. There's also other markets who will consider coming in, but usually sitting above or excess of those folks. So again, pretty healthy marketplace in terms of numbers. Any of those individual carriers can put up between 10 to 25 million based upon individual projects. And if we needed to build more, we would just build people excess. So we could actually put together quite a bit of limits for cost cap insurance. The carriers are willing to cover projects over a 10-year period, which is the max you can get. And then if we look at the cost, basically it's called rate on line. It's basically around 15 to 20%, depending upon the risk, and that's per million. So every million of insurance is going to cost roughly 150,000, maybe as high as 200,000. Now you may think that that's expensive because your PLL products are going to be costing right online, 1.5% to 6%, like depending upon the risk. But you know what? This is a high risk product. And even when carriers were collecting this during the old days, this was insufficient to cover risk. For those clients who actually bought it and paid 15 to 20%, one of the greatest return on premium investments they made. So again, it's appropriately priced for the risk given the losses that occur with this issue. Next slide. So how does it mechanically work? So this graphic kind of explains it. So if we start at the bottom and look at the blue box, there's a cleanup cost. We have a project. Usually your engineer, your internal folks will come in and say, okay, here's the most likely cost to clean up. And they'll have a scope of work, a detailed cost estimate, and a schedule. We then take that and we provide it to the insurer. Well, the insurer is going to take a look at it. And like any other project, they're going to say, okay, well, how well do we understand this? Is there decent certainty around site conditions? Have we accounted for all the different uncertainties? Or unit rates correct? So what they'll do is they're going to say, okay, we'll take your cost, but we're going to add something on top of it just because we don't want to, again, fly too close to the sun and immediately burn. So what they do is add a buffer. That buffer could be anywhere from 20 to 40%. So if you take the cleanup cost plus that buffer, combined, they're called the attachment point. And if we end up incepting a policy and costs go up through the cleanup cost, they go through the buffer and they exceed the attachment point, then the policy pays up through the limits of insurance. The real hard negotiations in this is the buffer. So that's the work that we do with you, your attorney, your technical folks, is trying to present the risk in the best light to be able to convince the carrier to provide the lowest possible buffer. So this is very highly technical, as well as very highly technical from an insurance perspective. How do you determine limits? Usually people would say, I want 1x the cost of the cleanups. The cleanups 10 million, give me 10 million in limits. A more thoughtful way to do it is actually to have your engineers say, okay, if we have a most likely estimate, what's the reasonable worst case? And basically the difference between those two should be the cost of insurance. So this is basically how it works. Pretty simple. Next slide. So what are the underwriting needs? Really three basic things. Site conditions. What do we know about the nature and extent of contamination? So if we're doing a cleanup with TCE and soil, okay, well, how many borings have we taken? What's the lateral extent? What's the depth? What are the concentrations? So all the variables that come around just understanding the nature of what we have. They'll take a look at a cleanup plan. So the cleanup plan has to detail what we're going to do to actually take this from its current condition to clean up and getting a no further action from a regulator. To the extent that there's regulatory correspondence, that helps provide some certainty around what needs to be done. And then sometimes most likely you're going to be 100% responsible for cleanup, but sometimes you may be involved in sites where there's other parties responsible, so PRPs. So if there are other parties, we just need to identify them and then who owes what share. And then finally, the cost estimate. And this is really important. So, walking in with an SEC FAS 5 estimate is usually insufficient because it doesn't look at total life cycle costs. So what we want to know is, hey, from today to no further action, what's the total spend going to be? We want to look at the cash flow of it because, again, cost cap can cover costs over 10 years. We want to understand what the spend limit is over the policy term. Then we want to see details. So line items. So it's like, hey, here's the cost is 10 million. Okay, let's see the breakdown. We're going to do these different activities. Here's the assumptions and here's the unit rates. So very basic stuff that you probably understand for yourself. Also, the carriers need that information. Next slide. Applications are really broad. If we start at the beginning, it's basically anybody who's got cleanup liabilities on your balance sheet. So if you just want to stop the pain of constantly having to accrue for more money or start projects and have them overrun, cost cap's a possibility. Usually you need to have a project that's about 2 million, $1.5 million in size to qualify. Stuff that's smaller than that is a little bit problematic, but anything over $1 million to $1.5 million to $2 million and up is viable. This comes up in M&A deals all the time. So both parties are, trying to deal with a cleanup. What do we do with it? We don't know what the ultimate cost is going to be. Guess what? We come in, we put cost cap insurance. Now we've got price certainty for both the buyer and seller. It comes up in settlements. It comes up in bankruptcies. You may still be doing guaranteed fixed price remediations and buyouts with specialty companies. And this is a very viable technique to make sure that their bid is minimized because, again, you don't want them to speculate for what the cost overrun could be and then build that into the offering. Instead, we come in with a more likely cost, use cost cap, and that helps to minimize the overall estimate. Next slide. So let's talk about a case study to make this real. So this is one that we did recently where we were working for a private equity company. They were looking to buy a chemical facility that was right next to a river. The EPA had already sent that target what's called a 104E letter, which is a notice to say, hey, listen, there's contamination in this river. We think you're responsible, so you're on notice. The challenge we had was there really wasn't a lot of data around the creek sediments. We didn't know the nature and extent of contamination because the creek wasn't fully investigated. And we knew there were others that were contributing, but we didn't know who they were or what the allocation was at that point. So we had a lot of uncertainty, but the company wasn't willing to invest unless this risk could be managed. So next slide. So the approach here basically, shows how creative the markets can be and flexible in trying to develop a solution. So in the absence of data, we had to basically develop scenarios of what could be out there. And what we didn't want to do is, in a vacuum, develop scenarios, give them to the carriers, have the carriers say, we don't buy into this, and then the time runs out on the transaction. So we actually brought the carriers in and said, we want you involved in the due diligence to help us understand what you need to see to underwrite this. What do you want to see in the analysis, the scenarios, the costs? So that was one thing that was relatively unique, and the carriers actually liked that. So now all of a sudden they were bought in day one so that when we delivered an outcome, they could underwrite to it. The other thing that was very good is the outside counsel who was working on it actually did an analysis of cost allocation. They identified all the companies in the area and the likely allocation that could be applied to this target. We had a relatively short period of time to do this. The client was looking for 25 million limits. And, again, we had a project that was actually 10 years and actually a little bit longer. So, a very short time frame to develop all this information, have it underwritten and done for the deal. Next slide. And the great news is, innovation was the solution. Again, these markets have been around for 8 years and they did a great job. Axis was the primary carrier. They were really responsive. They were highly creative. And they said, we're going to put out 15 million limits if there's overrun. And if your allocation risk, varies up to 5% of the total cost of the cleanup, we'll pick that up. We had guessed that shouldn't say guess, but the estimate was that we were around 2% likely to be liable. So guess what? If that estimate went up to 5%, they were going to pick up that overrun on just allocation risk, which again, highly creative. The investment committee came back and said, hey, this is all great, but we want allocation to cover up to 10%. This is where Ironshore came in. Ironshore was in the deal because they were providing excess limits. And they looked at it and said, we'll do this. If the allocation goes above 5%, we'll drop down to primary and pick up any allocation increases between 5 to 10%. So now all of a sudden they would drop down and be primary. If that didn't occur, then they would just stay on their excess position. So again, really innovative, creative approach on the behalf of Ironshore to help fix this solution. So the bottom line is we ended up with an attachment point that was pretty significant because again, remediation and sediments are pretty complex deals, but this got done and the deal was able to get closed. So a great example of how cost cap can work, but also how innovative these existing markets, are to get deals done and be responsive to you. Next slide. So that's it. Hopefully you've got a lot of great information out of this. If you have any questions or needs, here's my contact information. Don't hesitate to call me. And hopefully you'll be able to tune into some of our other short courses. The topics on those are going to include counterparty credit risk, asbestos third-party liabilities, and the M&A toolbox. With that, thank you and have a good rest of the day.